My name is Christy McCormick. I'm the Vice Chair of the Election Assistance Commission. I also want to thank Pepperdine University and Dean Peterson and the staff here who've been fantastic to work with, and Senators Blunt and Klobuchar and former President Bush for their statements. And I want to especially thank those who are participating and those of you who are here and watching online. This is panel 2 on security and technology in elections. When HAVA was passed 20 years ago, there was not a lot of thought given to cybersecurity. We were concerned with butterfly ballots, as you recall, with mechanical lever machines, with all kinds of different things than we are today. In the meantime, since maybe 7 or 8 years after the 2000 election, we had the advent of smartphones and all kinds of, it's a whole different environment. So times have changed, and election security is top of mind for officials and for the public. And as technology expands and evolves, attention to securing all aspects of the process requires 24/7 vigilance in order to stay ahead of the next attempted hack or scheme on our systems. Elections are now designated as critical infrastructure, and there has been a massive new ecosystem built around that realization and that designation. Coordination is one of our most powerful tools in the effort to secure elections, as is our desperate election system. We have ongoing coordination between the intelligence community, federal, state, and local partners, coordinating councils representing government and the private sector. These partnerships are supplemented with hundreds of millions of dollars in resources to bring our election practices, procedures, and equipment up to date, defended, and protected. Election officials find themselves now needing to be well-versed, if not experts, in IT and cybersecurity. This is a whole new role in elections that never existed previously. It's a complicated subject matter, as our experts on this panel can tell you, and it needs full-time focus in addition to a full-time focus on running elections themselves. Voters are concerned. There's been a lot of media attention on the election process and election technology in the past 5 years, and the American public wants to know what election officials are doing to safeguard the foundation of our democracy. The panelists joining me today will be able to speak on this, and I'd like to introduce each panelist. First, we have Professor Dan Wallach from Rice University and the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Next to him, we have Tracy Mapps, the Vice President of SLI Compliance. Their laboratory tests our voting equipment. And then finally, we have Mona Harrington, the Acting Assistant Director for National Risk Management Center, NRMC, from the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. So welcome to all our panelists. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say and following up with questions. So Professor Wallach, please feel free to start.
Okay, working audio? Yes. Chairman Hicks, Vice Chairman McCormick, thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to speak to all of you today. I should also mention that I'm on the EAC's Technical Guidelines Development Committee, the TGDC. So I had some tiny role in helping get the VVSG Voluntary Voting System Guidelines 2.0 across the finish line, which I think is fantastic. Just like Charles Stewart, I also got engaged in our elections shortly after the 2000 election. Prior to that, I worked on security of things like web browsers. I'm a computer scientist. I think I might be the only computer scientist in the room. So shortly after the 2000 election, suddenly everybody was like, hey, how do elections work? How did they not work right? How are we going to make them work better? And we started replacing older equipment, lever machines from, in some cases, as old as the 1930s, punch card machines from like the 1950s, that were no longer, the vendors who built them were long since out of business. And we replaced those in large part with computerized paperless electronic voting machines. And I was one of many computer scientists who found significant security vulnerabilities in those machines. And I'm very pleased to report that in the past 20 years, the situation has significantly improved. We have largely reduced the market share of paperless electronic voting machines. Most voters today either hand mark a paper ballot or have a ballot marking device that marks it for them. And that means that we have those paper ballots to stick around providing us evidence. Because at the end of the day, the winner is always very happy to win the election, but the loser requires evidence. And that helps us accomplish that goal. We saw that to some extent, especially in Georgia. Had Georgia been using its paperless machines in the prior election, things would have been a lot messier. So an interesting question, one of the things that's really novel when we talk about election security today versus 20 years ago is understanding the threat. What's our adversary? When you work in any kind of security, you always say, who's the threat? Who's the adversary? What do I have to deal with? And 20 years ago, if I'd told you that the adversary in our elections is a foreign nation state, whether that's Russia or China or Iran or somebody else, you would have said, that's crazy. A local election official trying to, it would have been incomprehensible for me to say that 20 years ago, our local election officials need to deal with foreign overseas adversaries trying to tamper with our elections. Yet today, yep, that's what we deal with. And it creates an amazing challenge, but also an amazing opportunity to create these federal, state, and local partnerships to bring the expertise to bear on the problem. So I'm going to talk super quick about two things that I think are the future of better evidence in our elections. And in the Q&A, we can talk about these things in more detail. The first thing I want to talk about is the risk-limiting audit. This was designed initially by Berkeley statistics professor Philip Stark, and is, I believe, 10 states are either requiring it or using it in pilot elections now. The idea of a risk-limiting audit is that you have computers are super fast at counting paper, but we don't want to trust the computers. And humans are very secure, but they're slow. So can we somehow combine these two in a meaningful way? And the answer is we get together and roll physical dice, and like 10-sided dice. D&D players are like, yeah, I got those. And we can bring the TV cameras, make it a very transparent, open, public process. And then that random number helps us decide which ballots we're going to sample from the broader population. The electronic ballots, the physical paper ballots had better match up exactly. And the cool mathematical observation, I'm going to spare you equations today, but the cool observation is if you only have to prove that any possible error is smaller than the margin of victory. And as long as you can prove that to a high degree of statistical certainty, then you can say, I'm confident we have the correct winner, and do it with a lot less work. So that's the idea of risk-limiting audits. They're being adopted increasingly by states. I think it's a really important way of improving election transparency that doesn't require any really new technology. The further fetched, awesome future science fiction, but hopefully less science fiction, is something called end-to-end cryptographic elections. This is something that I'm working on jointly with Microsoft and a number of other players. And the goal is to be able to publish all of the records of an election in a way that voters can verify that their vote was tabulated correctly, yet not be able to prove to a third party who they voted for. So we want to protect voter privacy, yet we want to have all this incredible public transparency so anybody can verify that the election officials produced the correct tally. If I tried to draw some equations here, I'd probably get yanked off the stage, but the math has been around since the 1980s. It's very well established, and the computational power has caught up to the point that modern day computers can do all of this very efficiently. So that's what I'm working, that's my research work, and I think that's going to be maybe a decade away from broad public adoption, although Microsoft is going to be doing a pilot election in an unspecified county this November, so we'll see.
Thank you, for Professor Wallach. Next, we'll go to Tracy Mapps, who's Vice President of SLI Compliance. Thanks for being here, Tracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair McCormick.
And I should say a Pepperdine mom as well.
I was going to say that.
Okay.
So I'll still keep it in here. Thank you for the invite to participate in this important event. In addition to recognizing HAVA at 20, I'd like to also congratulate Pepperdine University on the 25th anniversary of their School of Public Policy. For me, speaking at this event is especially fun because, like Vice Chair McCormick said, my son is an undergrad student here at Pepperdine. Seeing students that are interested in becoming the next generation of policy and political leaders in the U.S. is encouraging and exciting. The role of our policymakers in election technology has become even more important, along with the need for election officials to have an IT management mindset and skill set. This will become increasingly imperative in the future as technology continues to evolve and be implemented in elections throughout the U.S. To make a difference in the longer term, I feel that youth participation in politics and election technology is essential. Thank you so much for being here today. SLI Compliance is one of 2 accredited labs under the National Voluntary Accreditation Program of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and by the EAC is a voting system test lab qualified to test voting systems to federal standards. For those of you who don't know, Section 231B of the Help America Vote Act, HAVA 2002, requires that EAC provide for the accreditation of non-federal laboratories to test voting systems to federal standards. As an accredited test lab from the onset of HAVA, not only has SLI Compliance been testing electronic voting systems as an accredited lab from the onset of HAVA, but SLI Compliance was also designated as an independent test authority by the National Association of Election Directors when they first established an ITA certification program. We have been at the forefront of testing voting systems for more than 20 years. Time and time again, when talking about what I do, I find that people are not aware of the extensive testing that voting systems undergo before being utilized in elections. I often find myself educating people on what a voting system test lab, or VSTL, is and why they are a key behind-the-scenes contributor in helping to keep elections secure by conducting certification testing against the federal standards, while also partnering with the EAC and state and local jurisdictions. The certification test effort is an end-to-end process that examines, tests, and stresses the entire system from beginning to end. In addition to functional testing, document review, and hardware testing, secure source code reviews, trusted builds, and targeted security testing is conducted on voting systems by VSTLs. Once all VVSG requirements, about 1,200 of them, are determined to be met, a test report and a copy of the final trusted build is delivered to the EAC to be stored in their repository. With the increased concerns around elections and in an effort to increase confidence, we've been requested and have worked with election administrators to perform pre- and post-election configuration checks to verify that only certified or expected versions of the software and no unauthorized software is present on the election system that could compromise the integrity of the election process. Federal Information Processing Standards, or FIPS compliant hashing algorithms, are used to confirm that the software and data have not been modified in any manner from the originally tested baseline. This is just one example of how VSTLs, a part of the private sector, are working with election officials today to verify their voting systems and elections are secure. To provide an example of how the test and certification program is advancing to increase confidence in voting systems, with the newest version of EAC's Test and Certification Program Manual, VSTLs will perform penetration testing as a part of the test readiness review. VSTLs will conduct penetration testing using a standardized security analysis methodology approved by the EAC to identify architecture design and implementation flaws prior to the system undergoing certification testing. This could include identifying systemic, functional, reliability, or security flaws that could potentially change the outcome of an election, provide erroneous results for an election, or modify the audit trail all before the test campaign even begins. VSTLs will verify there is no malicious software or firmware that may have been introduced to change the outcome of an election, to provide erroneous results for an election, or to deny service to voters. There are obviously many aspects to consider in an effort to increase voter confidence in elections and the equipment used during elections. I feel that with the improved coordination between private and government sectors, like the work being done by the Critical Infrastructure Government and Private Sector Coordinating Councils, we have already made advances, and I look forward to new implementations to improve and protect the accessibility, accuracy, auditability, and security of elections before the celebration of 21 years of HAVA.
Thank you, Tracy. Next, we'll go to Mona Harrington from CISA, or National Risk Management Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman McCormick. Really excited to be here with all of you today in recognition of the 20th anniversary and the signing of HAVA and the 25th anniversary of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy to discuss security and technology in elections. Just a quick overview of CISA's mission in the election space. CISA's overarching mission is to ensure the security and resiliency of nation's critical infrastructure. As was mentioned previously, in January of 2017, DHS designated election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, which allowed DHS through CISA to prioritize federal assistance to the election subsector. Technology in the evolving threat landscape has shaped the role of election officials, and election officials have seen a significant expansion of their duties beyond simple election administration to a position more akin to technology and information managers and IT managers. The election community are on the front lines of phishing attempts, ransomware attacks, DDoS attacks, including cyber intrusions from both sophisticated nation states as well as non-nation state adversaries. As demonstrated in recent election cycles, our democracy faces continuing threats from foreign cyber and influence operations targeting the U.S. election infrastructure and voters. This persistent threat reaffirms the need to continue federal support to state and local election officials. State and local election officials cannot be expected to combat sophisticated nation-state sponsored threat actors alone. CISA has evolved to help meet the challenging security needs of the subsector and has ensured that the subsector has the tools and services and resources to combat these threats and to build resiliency into their systems. Since this designation, the subsector has made incredible progress improving the security and the resilience of our elections. CISA and its federal partners are much better positioned to get timely and actionable intelligence and information out to the election infrastructure subsector and into the hands of owners and operators of election infrastructure. CISA has strengthened its situational awareness of cyber activity and the cybersecurity risk landscape for election infrastructure by building strong relationships across the election infrastructure and subsector. Those partnerships are critical to our success. All 50 states and hundreds of election officials have deployed CISA-funded or state-funded intrusion detection sensors known as Albert sensors throughout the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, also known as the MS-ISAC. Hundreds of election officials and private sector election infrastructure partners have signed up for CISA cybersecurity services, ranging from recurring scanning for known vulnerabilities on internet-connected infrastructure to in-depth penetration testing. The subsector voluntarily shares information about potential cybersecurity incidents and anomalous activity on their networks to CISA, the EISAC, and the FBI. Election officials continue to make incredible progress in securing and building resilience to the election infrastructure. CISA is ensuring the security of our election infrastructure, and it remains one of our highest priorities at the agency. Thank you.
Thanks, Mona. I'll start with you on a question. You talked about resiliency, and we hear that term a lot. What does that really mean? Like, when we talk to the public about resiliency, can you give me kind of a definition of what that means in the voting system space?
Yeah, sure. You know, resiliency is about mitigation strategies, hardening systems, ensuring that you have safeguards in place, that you're able to forecast potential risk, and you're able to map that potential risk to strategies that would help mitigate that risk. Hardening systems, securing networks, and ensuring that you have compensating controls and a defense in depth approach to how you look at your entire security posture and ways to strengthen that.
It sounds like a big job and big responsibility with lots of time. What kind of resources does CISA have to help election officials with that?
CISA has quite a bit of resources. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to look at the CISA.gov website, but we offer a number of services through the EII-SAC. We put out alerts. We offer threat briefings that are both classified and declassified. We have a number of resiliency type best practices and guides to educate and put out materials, factual materials, educational materials. We offer tabletops and other election related trainings that are customizable, work products and toolkits and such, so that election officials can take those products and turn them in what they need to with the threats that they may be specifically facing. So there's no shortage of services. We also have PSAs in the space, regionally located, where those are protective cyber security advisors that election officials can contact, and a number of best practices on our sites. We offer cyber security scanning services and other services that can assist election officials immediately and improve the security posture.
Tracy, you described some of the details of the testing program of voting systems. It seemed like not so long ago, no one really cared about that other than some academics like Professor Wallach. But now everyone is interested in that. Can we trust our voting systems? How do we educate the public on what you do, or do you have some ideas on that and the many layers of what goes into a testing program on the voting systems?
That's a good question. I think that's something that I've thought about myself, is just how to educate the public on what we do. I think having forums like we have today talking about testing that's done by voting system test labs is one way. I think the EAC can also help with that. I think that there's information on the EAC website that shares information about the voting system test labs, about the accreditation process, shares information about the voluntary voting system guidelines that we test to. I think states and jurisdictions could also do the same. The majority of states require that a voting system is either certified by the EAC or tested by a voting system test lab. And I think sharing that information with public, with their elections officials, their voters, would be beneficial.
Professor Wallach, you mentioned risk-limiting audits, or RLAs, and that they're increasingly being used to validate elections, and maybe we need to get D&D players involved with that process. But are there any downsides to RLAs, and are they measurably better than other types of audits?
So one way to think of an RLA is a more efficient recount. So we could imagine doing a recount on any election at any time, but I think I was chatting with Dean Logan earlier, and he said we have 3.5 million ballots in Los Angeles. That could take a while to count. Whereas in a risk-limiting audit, if the margin is relatively wide, you might only need to look at 100 ballots. And 100 ballots might give you a 95% confidence interval that you have the correct outcome. That's a lot more efficient. That's an afternoon of work rather than a week of work. And if the RLA fails, or rather if it fails to meet the risk limit, then that means you have to do more work. But that also means that you've perhaps uncovered evidence that something went wrong. And so that's a good thing. If you have a process and a procedure that can efficiently say, looks good, or something is weird here, we need to look in more detail. If that's part of a regular election official's procedure, that helps mitigate against some of these cyber risks that we've been talking about. It's good to have process and procedure that can find problems and mitigate them.
So if you're counting 100 ballots when you have that many, as the election gets closer, you're counting many more ballots, right? Where is the point at which it doesn't pay to do a risk limiting audit?
Yeah,
Is there that point?
So it turns out that your goal is to say that the margin of error is smaller than the margin of victory. So in the limit, if I have an election decided by 1 vote, then my margin of error I can tolerate is 1. And that means that we're going to end up doing a full recount. But that's often something that happens in procedures that have been in place prior to RLAs, that very close elections sometimes have automatic recounts. So that's not crazy. What I like about this is that most elections don't have these crazy tight margins, yet we can still gain assurance. And especially when we have people who are questioning election outcomes, with or without any basis to question those election outcomes, if we can provide evidence, if we can provide publicly visible procedure, then that can help mitigate some of the misinformation that we talked about in the prior panel.
So for all of you, from your perspective, how has the election security landscape changed since elections were designated as critical infrastructure in 2017? And I'll start with you because you're right here. So what's your perspective on how things have changed since it's been designated critical infrastructure?
So I was invited to testify at a House hearing in September of 2016, and this was exactly what was one of the topics at hand. And I think the single biggest change is that the federal government piled in resources through CISA, and that had an enormous impact. That we're from the government and we're here to help actually happened, and it was helpful. Not everybody appreciates the federal-state split between how elections work. Election law is different in each of the 50 states, and many states are suspicious of the federal government nosing into their election business. But the expertise to deal with the nation-state threats is generally not with the states and local election officials. And what CISA did, to their credit, I'm going to toot your horn for you, is be helpful. I mean, imagine that. They actually really were helpful and helped build these procedures, penetration testing, and that had a real positive impact.
Ronald Reagan is rolling over in his grave right now. Just over the hill. Tracy, what are your thoughts on has your testing regime changed? What's happened since elections were designated?
I don't know about testing regimes necessarily. I do have to say, just along the lines of what Professor Wallach said, I think that since the designation of critical infrastructure, there's now a more collaborative effort and focus on security, that we're now working together. Manufacturers, voting system test labs, CISA, government officials. I think that there's now this lifeline to a support system that can offer assistance to anyone in those areas, from network security challenges to election crises and even supply chain management. I think that there's now, like I said, this lifeline of support. We've undergone some of those assessments that Mona speaks about that has been huge for our test lab, to make sure that we address any of those vulnerability risks that maybe we didn't see in-house. We brought someone else in to take a look at those. And I think that's where we've made the biggest focus.
Mona, what are your thoughts on how things have changed?
Yeah, so to Dan's point, I think, thank you. we want to help, we do help. Our services and what we provide has significantly increased. I think our partnerships, our relationships with the federal government, our relationships with state, local, tribal territories has improved dramatically. I think our, just in general, since 2017, the attacks have become much more sophisticated, and the volume of attacks has certainly increased. And so with the sophistication and the volume, we've all had to really work together to come up with strategies on how to really secure the posture. I think we've come a really long way. I think we could list a lot of partnerships as well as services and products that speak to how far election officials have come since 2017 and the situational awareness on what we really need to start thinking about with forecasting risk and mitigating risk in advance and becoming more resilient. And so, but there's still more work to be done, of course, and we have no reason to expect that our adversaries are going to back off now or in 2024.
So staying with you, the current threat environment necessitates a coordinated response from all levels of government and support from our private sector partners as well. What resources are available to assist election officials to assess and improve their current security posture? You kind of touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned a little bit of this already, just reviewing that again with all of you. The classified and unclassified briefings are really important because that's our ability to share information. Where possible, CISA will declassify information to get the right information into owner and operator's hands so that they can make a meaningful difference and deal with that potential threat. The EII-SAC has alerts that go out that are very useful to understand what actions you can take, election officials can take to quell those threats. There's over 3,400 election entities that have joined that service. If you're an election official and you haven't joined that service, highly recommend that you do that. One thing we hadn't talked about is the Government Coordinating Council and the Sector Coordinating Council. I think that partnership, especially with the Election Assistance Commission, is incredibly helpful. The Election Assistance Commission co-chairs the Government Coordinating Council with CISA, and that partnership is incredibly useful in just sharing information and, again, trying to mitigate threats. We also have a number of assessments and different tools, both for physical and cyber potential threats in the space, so those can be utilized. I think it's really important to note that all of these services that I'm talking about that are offered are free of charge and available. I think one of the things that election officials certainly can do is, the Department of Justice stood up a crime task force, and so there are resources in every region from the FBI in case there are threats or other incidences that need to be reported. It's good to get to know that person that serves your area prior to an incident. You don't want to exchange business cards when you're in the middle of an incident. So I think it's a great idea to get to know your regional resources, also the CISA resources that are out there, including the protective security advisors that are located out in the region. So there's a number of resources, and we continue to add more. We've got last mile products. I don't know if you've heard of those, but those are customizable, and election officials can add in what they need to add in that would speak more to their jurisdiction and the way that they administer elections.
As I say, fully plagiarizable.
Exactly.
In every other environment, that's a no-no. In this one, do it. The EAC recently adopted VVSG 2.0. What effect do you believe these new guidelines will have on the future of voting system security and accessibility? And we'll start with you, since you were a part, Dan, of the TGDC that recommended these guidelines.
Wow. So the earlier guidelines were very, very detailed in ways that you'd have to be a real computer nerd to appreciate. Functions must be so many lines of code and only a certain amount of branching, and they have very, very particular things to say. The VVSG 2.0 takes a big step backward and describes principles. Your code should be clean, it should be readable, it should be extensible, rather than micromanaging it. Instead, it has these broad principles, and the principles give more opportunity for vendors to innovate. So that all by itself is, in many respects, it's catching up with modern software engineering as it's practiced in the rest of the industry. That's great. There's more room for a vendor to innovate rather than feeling they need to check literally thousands of checkboxes. We'll see how many checkboxes it turns into, because nobody's actually been certified to VVSG 2.0 yet. Coming soon. I know one vendor is working on it real hard. I've done some consulting with Voting Works, which is a not-for-profit trying to break into this space, and I can talk about some of that experience later if anybody wants to hear about it. Anyway, so the VVSG also has this notion of cryptographic voting systems that I hinted at earlier, and I think NIST is holding a workshop on that in the next month or two. I mean, this is further out, but it was contemplated in the VVSG 2.0. So we have a lot of room to make things even better in the future, which I think is, again, fantastic stuff.
And Tracy, your lab is about ready to get accredited to testing 2.0 systems.
Woo-hoo.
Yeah.
It's been a long process.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're very excited.
Yeah.
Speak to 2.0?
Yeah,
maybe
if
in
you
the
could.
future. I agree with you, Dan. I think that there are some very specific requirements that I think that are going to help enhance voting systems in the future. I made some notes of these because I tend to get scattered and I don't want to forget anything. But there are some very specific accessibility requirements that are going to help to provide more consistent experience for all voters, and that's exciting. I think that a number of accessibility requirements are included to support full accessibility throughout the voting process. And not only are the systems going to be required to meet accessibility requirements for voters, but the systems are also going to need to be usable and accessible for election workers, which I think is different from the previous requirements, which is exciting. There are a number of new cybersecurity requirements that require election systems such as e-poll books, voter registration systems, election reporting systems to be air-gapped from the voting system. That's all good stuff and very important. The VVSG 2.0 also requires that a voting system be incapable of broadcasting a wireless network. Just to speak to some of what you brought up with the risk limiting audits, there are some auditability requirements that are going to help enhance the ability for election officials to identify failures in system software so they can be detected and resolved easier. I think that you talked about there, when doing the risk limiting audits, I think that some of these changes with these requirements are going to make it easier to find some of those problems during those audits and other types of audits. Manufacturers are also going to be required to provide procedures to verify that cast records are correctly tabulated. And that was not something that was in the previous requirements. So those are just, I think, some specifics that I think are going to help to enhance our voting systems going forward.
Yeah, and actually, you talked about accessibility. That was one of the major focuses of the Help America Vote Act, that we needed to make our systems accessible. And we've made great strides in that area, but we still have a long way to go.
We have a long way to go, but I think these are going to be huge improvements with 2.0.
Mona, do you have anything to add to that?
I'm just really excited to see the standards get put into play and see new voting machines come out and watch how that market evolves and get us into a much better cybersecurity posture and physical posture with compensated controls and a real new set of guidelines that are long overdue. So really excited to see that getting closer.
Long overdue. Like over a decade overdue. So, and Professor Wallach, you mentioned, that there's a little piece of E2E in VVSG 2.0. Is E2E in the far future of technology, or is it closer than it appears in the mirror?
If there's, you've perhaps heard the phrase internet time, where things move very quickly. That was certainly the case in the early 2000s, where things were evolving very rapidly in the space of .com companies. Elections operate on a very different time scale. Change happens over a pace of decades, not over a pace of months. That's just how it is. And the current generation of systems that are being purchased don't have these kinds of sophisticated cryptographic features, and that's okay. So let's see, what can I say that's public? Microsoft has announced that they're working with Harrington, which is one of the big three vendors, and HART is running Microsoft's Election Guard, which is this end-to-end encrypted system, inside their existing hardware platform, their Verity something, ballot marking device scanner. And that will be deployed at a not publicly announced yet county this November for some kind of trial election. So going from pilots and trials to figuring out where, wow, we had a problem here, we need to fix that. Going from an election in a small undisclosed county to, say, the largest county in the US, going from, say, 5,000 ballots to 3 million ballots, there are going to be issues and speed bumps, and we're going to get over them. It's probably not, I would say 10 years on the long end. Maybe we'll do something sooner, someplace sooner. I'm very bad at predicting the future, but I think we're going to get there, and it's going to be very exciting to have that extra level of transparency in our elections.
Does this include blockchain?
Oh dear. Would you believe that my Lyft driver on the way up was quizzing me about blockchain? This is what happens when you say you're a computer scientist. Do not buy cryptocurrencies. Anyway, so underneath every electronic cryptographically verifiable voting system, there's some notion of publishing all of the encrypted ballots to the public. So that translates to a web server or something which has a database full of these things that you can download. That doesn't mean we need to burn down forests to find hash collisions. But there might very well be data structures built from hash functions. So that's intellectually adjacent to a blockchain, but there's none of this proof of work nonsense. So if you understand how a blockchain works, you're 80% of the way to understanding what a public bulletin board is. But we're not burning down forests, and spending money is not the same thing as voting. Those are different kinds of transactions.
We still have privacy in voting, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah, there's this sort of naive thing that says, if I can spend money anonymously, that feels like voting. Therefore, I have a system I can use to vote, and let's vote on the internet. There are like 3 massive intellectual leaps shoved into that one little sentence, and we are nowhere near ready for that.
That's true. So following on the last panel, how can security and we've touched on this a little bit, how can the security of the systems be used to increase public confidence in elections? Or is the electorate going to get disillusioned and demand hand counting of paper ballots? We've heard some of this out in the, social media atmosphere. Anybody want to talk about that?
Okay. Hand counting has a problem, which is that it's slow and surprisingly inaccurate. Humans make errors. So I hope that that's not the immediate solution that everybody says to our problems, because getting timely election results matters. And so I think the efficiency of an RLA-style process is going to be important. And I love the thing that the panelists in the prior panel spoke about, which is the importance of getting people engaged in the process as poll workers to see how it works from the inside. And that's really important. This panel isn't really about misinformation and disinformation, and I don't know how we're going to fix that problem. But if we can provide better evidence and better transparency, then I'm going to borrow a phrase from the prior panel. The people who are open to persuasion can be persuaded, and that's better than nothing.
If I can just add on to that, and it's a little bit separate, but I think the importance of working as election workers or poll workers really is so important. And that's something that we've done in our lab, is that we've encouraged our testers, our test engineers, to go out and work as poll workers. I think it gives them the ability to see what's really happening in the field, to go out and use the system in a different way rather than just being in a test lab and testing to the different requirements. But you've got, you know, voter A here and voter B here, and they're throwing this at you and throwing that at you, and then trying to use the equipment. It gives you just a completely different perspective and understanding of how important it is that these systems are secure, usable, and whatnot.
Yeah. So Mona, CISA and the cyber security community often uses the phrase defense in depth. Can you talk about this concept and how it applies to securing election systems?
Yeah, sure. So in my mind, defense in depth is an information security approach that incorporates layers of controls and multiple mitigations and redundancies. So you want to avoid any single point of failure, but you also want to protect against a variety of cybersecurity threats. So there's no one mitigation strategy that's going to address all of that. So you have to think in terms of how do I stack my security so that I'm covering all potential threats within what looks like the attack vector. So when you are designing that, you're adding multiple controls and ensuring that you're implementing a sound and robust security plan. Some examples of that with elections include intrusion detection systems, network segmentation, robust multi-factor authentication, the Albert sensors, other security layers that would help with compensating controls, or even policies and procedures can also be part of that defense in-depth approach, just because they will guide a certain approach of how you do something that helps protect, whether it's cybersecurity or physical. So it's a multitude of security layers that all formulate together to really increase that cybersecurity posture. Some of the other things, you know, when I think of defense in depth, I think of chain of custody, audits, logic and accuracy testing. Again, all of those different compensating controls come together to formulate that strong security posture with that defense in depth mindset.
How are we doing in that area? How's the election community? Are we there yet, or we still have a lot of work to do?
I think the election community does an incredible job with defense in depth. I think really that's a very real narrative that is really providing layers of security. So if you talk about voting machines, you're not just talking about the VVSG and what those standards are, you're also talking about all of the physical controls and other compensating controls and post-election audits and logic and accuracy testing. And the combination of all that is what gives you the accurate picture of what the security looks like. And if you take any one of those pieces out, you're not getting a full picture. I think some of the narratives and things that we heard in the last couple of years don't always take into consideration the reality that there is a defense in-depth approach and there are multiple layers that give you a more accurate picture of what the security posture looks like.
Anybody else want to add to that?
So I'll just say, like a simple example of having paper ballots and electronic tallies and electronic records means that if you accidentally lose one, you still have the other. Whereas, so even if somebody managed to hack into the computer somehow and cause them to arrange for the wrong tally to be published, you have this other path to get back to the ground truth. And so using the right policies and procedures, you can be resilient against different threats. It's not to say that somebody can't hack the computer, but we're going to make that harder. And it's not to say that somebody can't stuff the paper ballot box, but we're going to make that harder too. But combining them together, we can defend against both. And all of that raises the bar.
I think along with that, just another key point is that when we look at voting systems and we're doing certification testing, one of the things that we look at is the documentation, the procedures that the manufacturers submit to us around the voting systems. And I think election officials need to make sure that they're using those documents, those procedures that are put out by the manufacturers. If you're not following those procedures, I think that you could have configuration type issues, configuration setup type issues, security issues, those types of things. So it's very important to use the manufacturer procedures that have been verified and certified by the EAC.
So what about open source technology? I mean, our vendors are very close to the vest about their technology and their codes and their software and everything. Can we keep our systems protected that way? Is that a route we should think about taking?
So I'll go out on a limb, since I'm an academic, and take a strong position and say that trade secrets have no place in our elections. This is not a widely held view, but if vendors have intellectual property they want to protect, that's what copyright and patent are for. But I think trade secrecy goes against the transparency that we want for our election outcomes. So the incumbent mainstream vendors don't seem to buy into this idea, and maybe we can push them with regulation. I mentioned VotingWorks, which is a not-for-profit startup that's trying to compete in this space. And everything that VotingWorks does is open source. The Microsoft Election Guard project that I'm participating in, that's all open source. And I think that there's a lot of room for open source to find its way into other parts of the election system.
Does that open it up also to the bad guys to figure out our system?
Well, see, the thing is, you have to, if our bad guy, our threat model is nation-state adversaries, we have to assume that our nation-state adversaries are familiar with the sophisticated technology of eBay, and that they can acquire used copies of these machines and reverse engineer them and find the attacks. So the adversary already knows everything they need to know in order to attack these systems. Therefore, why not let everybody else in, and then maybe we can find more problems and fix them earlier.
Any other thoughts on that, on the panel? Nope. Nobody's going to address that. The academic will. So as we look toward the next 20 years of HAVA and election technology, what do you see as the biggest challenge and opportunity for election officials and the election-related agencies like the EAC or CISA? Is it staying ahead of the bad guys, communicating the security of the system, something else? What are our biggest challenges and opportunities?
So when I think of the next 20 years, I think election officials will have a regular funding stream. They don't have that. I think having additional funding to be able to make the investments that are needed, regardless of what the challenges are today, whether it's cybersecurity or it's dis and malinformation or it's buying a cyclical replacement that might cost you, enormous amounts of money to change your voting machines in your state or your jurisdiction. So having the funding to do that, I think, positions election officials really well to be able to invest in their networks and whatever issues or challenges they're having. It's really hard to say what would be happening in 20 years, but in a perfect world, the VVSG is an iterative, agile product that voting machine vendors can build robust, modern, secure systems, and those systems can be patched regularly without concern, almost a cultural or mind shift into the next 20 years of we've got to stay on top of this. We can't be afraid to patch and what it'll do. The systems have to become more modern and secure, and the entire process from cradle to grave, from a new system being built to the iterative VVSG process, all have to work in a synergy that allows for a very quick turn to respond to threats, because the bad actors are creating them quicker than we are finding solutions. So in my mind, in 20 years from now, election officials will have really robust funding that they can count on. Voting machines will be in a much better place and be updated much more regularly. The market will be much more competitive. And last but certainly not least, the Election Assistance Commission would be funded better and positioned to be able to carry out their mission successfully with the vast responsibility with testing and certification and how critical that is to making our critical infrastructure more resilient.
Thank you, Mona. As our former executive director, we appreciate the cheerleading. Tracy or Dan, do you have challenges, opportunities in the next 20 years?
You know, I think it's hard for me to speak to from an election official standpoint. I'm certainly not on the front line having to deal with fighting disinformation or threats to physical harm, those types of things. I feel like everyone is doing what they should be doing, trying to educate the public and working collaboratively between private sectors and government sectors to find solutions. I think we need to continue to support one another and share information about the issues that we've had along with the solutions that we've learned, and to continue to grow from our findings.
And Dan, before you address this, if you have questions, fill out your cards, and Melissa will be coming around to collect those cards so we can ask your questions as well. Go ahead, Dan. Challenges and opportunities.
So, without a doubt, the end-to-end encrypted election technologies, I think, are something in the next 20 years that will go from, cool idea to real-world deployment, and we will discover issues, and that'll be, and 20 years from now, we might actually really figure it out. And that might require rethinking how we test and certify. It might create a very different relationship between testing and certification labs and voting system vendors. And that's going to be, because then you might have to have like a standardized component that the cryptographic component the vendor doesn't touch. And then they come to you, the certification lab, and they say, we're using Election Guard and we didn't mess with it. And you go, okay, check. And exactly how that's going to work will be really interesting. Saying we didn't mess with it, but we just had to break it around the edges. Those details might matter in so many weird and inexplicable and hard to predict ways. I could also see that as we iterate, both in terms of speeding up, I love this idea of speeding things up. I'm going to borrow a military term called an OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. And when military theorists are planning their things, they say whoever can do that loop faster wins. If you can outmaneuver the adversary, you're going to win. And that applies in elections versus election adversaries as well. We need to be able to get greater agility in how election officials conduct their business. And that's going to be a real sea change. I mean, right now we have election equipment in some parts of this country that's still running software that's over a decade old. And that's just not going to fly in the future. We're going to have to be able to move much more quickly.
So let's go to some of the questions, and I will do what Commissioner Hicks did. This question is, how do you build trust when voter trust is built on transparent, quote, glass box technologies, not, quote, black box technologies, and proprietary administrative hardware? Anybody want to try that one? You don't.
So I guess the older round of electronic voting systems were very much a black box. Voters touched the screen or spun the wheel. They said, and then you say cast your vote, and it waves a little American flag, and then at the end of the day they announce who wins. And there was no transparency at all between that where you hit the enter button and what came out at the end. And that was there were like multiple books titled Black Box Voting or Black Box this. That was where we were in the early 2000s. Where we are today is significantly better than this. This is where the paper and the process and the auditing comes in. So it's definitely an improvement in terms of transparency. And I almost wonder if the problem is that people just aren't aware of how much things have improved. That a lot of this change has come very recently, and that we haven't wrapped our heads around what it's going to mean and how it's going to work.
Anybody else want to tackle that question?
I think it's a little hard to, be concerned that you don't know exactly what the source code looks like and what's in the machine for that to result in a complete lack of trust because of the way modern technology works and where we are with systems and technology in general. To me, I think maybe just pivoting a little bit, maybe it's more about election officials allowing for observers, election officials putting out educational materials, election officials pre-bunking where there are big opportunities for misunderstandings and misinformation, and just really education around the process, the controls, how does it work, is there a paper trail, can you verify that it was cast as intended, all of those questions that voters want to know and should get those answers. And so elections are clearly decentralized, and educating yourself through trusted voices and figuring out exactly how elections are run and what those processes and procedures, what the legislation says as far as how it works, and educating yourself on that would probably bring, in my mind, more confidence than knowing the zeros and ones of the source code and or what's behind, quote unquote, the black box.
Mm-hmm. Tracy?
I think that we do source code review. We look at the code on the voting systems, and we do extensive code review, security code reviews. And so maybe it's, instead of opening that up for other people to see, maybe it is that education of what those code reviews might entail, how extensive the testing is done by the voting system test labs. I think, like I said in my opening statement, time and time again, I talk to people and they have no idea that there are voting system test labs out there that are doing testing on voting systems. And I think that educating people to let them know about the testing that's being done may be helpful.
So this question, will the technology grow more complicated to the point, quote, user error is going to become a big problem? Or are we going in the opposite direction? Is it getting easier, harder?
Yeah, I think when I was with the Election Assistance Commission and we worked with the TGDC and NIST and all of our wonderful partners in developing the voluntary voting system guidelines, one of the really important pieces of that was usability. I'd also like to think as technology advances exponentially as it is, that would become less and less of an issue because usability is incredibly important, and so is accessibility and the experience. And so I actually think we have a lot of other challenges, and that may not necessarily be one that's top of mind right now.
I'd say usability is improving. The earlier voting machines often had like touchscreen calibration issues, or the click wheel on the Hardinger Civic, as you spun the wheel faster, the cursor didn't move in the same linear way. It was a mess. A lot of really basic usability work has gone on and has paid off. There's a group called the Center for Civic Design, Whitney Quisenberry and company. They have done so much work on what's the right font size, what are the right colors, how much information on a screen is too much. Some of my colleagues at Rice, who are psychologists who I work with, have done a ton of work on how do we make sure that voters notice any discrepancies. So that way, we modified our in-house prototype voting machine to lie to the user on the summary screen. You vote A for president, it shows you B, and measure how many voters notice. And you can change things about how you present information to increase the likelihood that people notice these things, because these are things you want the voter to notice. And so these are, in some sense, active research topics that will feed back into the design and engineering of voting machines.
So here's a question from a School of Public Policy student. While a risk-limiting audit would give a 95% or 99% confidence interval on the results of our election, there's undoubtedly the possibility that an RLA can provide an incorrect election result. Given an already skeptical American public in regard to election security, would an RLA serve to increase confidence in elections?
So I can tell you the numbers. I can't tell you how people will internalize those numbers. You know, when I tell you that I have a 95% confidence that I have the correct outcome of the election, what that, you know, when I say confidence interval equals 95%, that has a very precise statistical meaning. But unless you've taken a bunch of stats classes, you might misinterpret that. So ultimately, the way I expect that we will develop public confidence in the outcome of our elections is the same way we develop public confidence in everything, which is that we trust experts. We trust the television pundit. We trust the newspaper editor who declares something as a, you know, we delegate our trust in the real world. You know, why do I believe that my car is going to be safe when I get into a crash? You know, did I personally go and verify the structural engineering of my car? No, I'm trusting that there was a certification process that my car wouldn't have been sold to me if it wasn't crashworthy. And that I'm trusting a process. I might not be trusting the car dealership, but I trust the engineering and I trust the certification and testing. There's something like that here, that at the end of the day, we can provide evidence that only an expert might be able to know exactly what it means to say we have a 95% confidence that we have the correct outcome. But those experts are the people who are going to be, you know, the talking heads on the television. And if the experts are convinced, then they will help convince the persuadable population. I love that turn of phrase. I'm going to use that often.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? No? Okay. What are your thoughts on the testing of non-voting election systems like electronic poll books or ballot delivery systems? Tracy?
What
Start
are my
with you.
thoughts?
Yeah.
I think that all of these components should be tested. I think right now, unfortunately, we don't have an EAC certification program for that, but I think it's something that you are looking at. And so I think it's important, you know, in developing those standards to test those systems too, you know, we need to pull together a number of individuals, individuals from state and local jurisdictions, tech, experienced people, CISA folks, VSTLs, manufacturers, to help identify what the best standards are to test all of that election equipment too. There are some states that are already doing testing on their e-poll books, their voter registration systems, election night reporting. As a voting system test lab, we've participated in a lot of that testing, but I do feel that there should be a central set of standards that these systems are tested to, so that they can be certified and help election officials to make sure that these systems are secure.
Can you discuss how common data formats, interoperability, and component testing could impact or influence the voting equipment market in the future?
Oh yeah. So right now, every election vendor has their own data formats for everything. And what that means is that if you're trying to, I don't know, build an election auditing tool that's reading in digital ballot formats, you have to build an importer for each vendor, because they're all slightly different. And if we had truly common data formats, then you'd be able to mix and match. Then you'd be able to buy a voting system from one vendor, but you'd be able to buy an election management system from another vendor. Wouldn't that be cool? That would increase competition in the market. Right now, you kind of buy everything all at once. And so a vendor either wins the whole contract for a county or they win nothing. Common data formats could potentially break that up. That would be huge for, you know, actual market forces to do their work.
And maybe some innovation.
Yeah, that would allow a smaller vendor to come in and say, we are going to do this one little piece, and we're going to do that little piece better than anybody else, and we're going to connect to and integrate with all your existing stuff.
Yeah, that interoperability is key.
right now, I mean, not everybody realizes this. The computer industry used to be super vertically integrated. You didn't buy an IBM mainframe and then an Oracle database and then a different application. You bought the whole software stack from hardware up to the software. Everything you'd buy from IBM or Wang or one of these other old companies. And the small, scrappy little startup named Microsoft came along and smashed that. And we created the idea that you can get your PC from one company, your OS from Microsoft, your applications from somebody else. And that was a revolutionary idea. And now today, when I need to go buy a printer or whatever, a monitor, anything for my computer, I've got competition. The voting systems industry is absolutely not like that at all. They're still like the computer industry of the 1960s. And it would be so awesome if they caught up to the 80s.
Anybody else on that?
I won't disagree that common data formatting is a good thing. I think that there are pros and cons of integrating systems, and the whole idea of testing those integrated systems makes my head spin. It's a lot.
It's component testing, really.
It's component testing, and then making sure that those components work with other pieces. It's complex.
Yeah.
And so I think that with VVSG 2.0, there's that introduction of common data formatting. And I think that there's a lot to consider going forward to get to an integrated system using various components.
So there has been, we've touched on this, there has been some noise about moving to hand-marked and hand-counted ballots. What would that do to the election process?
It would be very, very slow. And speed matters.
Yeah. Yeah, it would affect voter confidence.
Yeah, and when we have, I think my ballot this fall in Texas is probably going to have somewhere north of 70 or 80 questions for me to answer. So tabulating ballots that have that many contests on them, in Texas we vote for our judges, 30, 40, 50 of them. It just goes, the ballot goes on forever. And as long as that's what ballots look like, hand tabulating those kinds of ballots would just take forever. That's it. Let's use computers for what they're good at, and then come up with policies and procedures around it to mitigate against the risks.
So one last question, and when I read this, I think of that commercial where the old lady says, "That's just not how it works." We've heard a lot about how the systems may have been hacked in 2020 and the results filtered through computers in Germany or Italy or China. Can that really happen? Does that happen?
There's zero evidence that any of that actually happened. The only public evidence that I'm aware of is that is in the misinformation and disinformation side of the house. But in terms of actually monkeying with the ballots and the tabulation, there is absolutely zero evidence that any of that has happened at all. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that I don't know what the basis is for any of these claims.
I think there's a combo of technological, physical, procedural controls that election officials use to secure voting systems. There's the logic and accuracy testing, the robust chain of custody, post-election tabulation audits, other security measures, and that's really, with a question like that, I think relying on those procedures and compensating controls, is probably a sound way to look at something like that. Dan said, the evidence is not there, but there's also a lot of controls that are in place to mitigate that kind of risk.
So last question, I'm sorry we can't get to all these cards, but And just yes or no. Can the electorate trust our voting systems? Mona?
I'd say yes, absolutely. Just
Tracy?
with all the compensating controls that I just went through, I would say absolutely yes.
Tracy?
I think that no system is foolproof. But I think that with procedures, compensating controls, all of the testing that's done prior to a voting system being put into an election, yes.
Dan?
I think I'm going to agree. The answer is yes, but. And the but is not too bad. So, yes.
So none of you actually abided by my instructions, which was just a yes or no. But
I
I want to say
tried.
thank you to this panel for, I know a lot was in depth and detail. Thank you to all of you for participating and providing us your remarks. So thank you.